partly why I hate writing them. It's they're also illegal. At least they are in the U.S., even though people don't understand that yet. But I know the law and I know the validity statistics. So, and what you're required to do. So then you might also ask, so the other selection methods are also biased and unreliable. You could say, well, you could hire someone based on their academic history, but roughly that's an index of intelligence and conscientiousness anyways. It's just not a very good one, especially because there's tremendous variability between schools. So if you have a GPA of 4.0 from school X and this person has a GPA of 4.0 from school Y, there's no reason at all to assume that those are comparable. So you can use grades, but that's full of measurement error, so that's not.
The Devil Rays are coming off a win in their previous game.
You could guess.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Dwayne Kuiper joined by former Giants All-Star Mike Krukow for tonight's MVP baseball game with EA Sports.
But
should be a great ball game. Here's the starter, Bronson Arroyo.
And here's something to think about.
Welcome to this American League matchup featuring the Tampa Bay Devil Rays and the Boston Red Sox. Here's the game's first batter, Carl Crawford. There aren't too many left-handed hitters who enjoy.
So maybe the manager is less intelligent than the workers. That might be one possibility. Or maybe the manager is less creative than the workers are. Maybe the manager is less conscientious or whatever, it doesn't matter. Some dimension of competence is not well matched with the demands of the job. Well, then one of the questions is, what exactly are you doing to the manager? Well, you're basically setting them up to fail, and a tremendous number of managers fail in the first 2 years of their promotion. It's well above 50%. And so that's not so good for them, but then you're also dooming the 10 people that they're supervising to a kind of horrible perdition for the time it takes for everyone to calculate that the manager is actually failing. And what that means generally is that the very highly qualified people who were patrol will just leave, because why would they put up with that? So then you might think, well, is it unethical to select properly, or is it ethical to select randomly, or exactly how should you solve that problem? And the answer is, well, we do try to solve it because we use selection methods, but we usually use ones that aren't very accurate. It's funny too, because I tried selling accurate selection tests to corporations for a very long period of time. And one of the things I learned is they didn't want them. That was mind-boggling to me, because the economic utility in hiring people who are competent compared to people who aren't is so high. It's absolutely mind-boggling, because the difference in productivity between people isn't normally distributed. It's Pareto distributed. Some people are staggeringly more productive than other people. So tilting your selection criteria so that you pick from the more productive end of the distribution means incredibly powerful economic benefits for your company. But at least when I was doing this to begin with, human resources people, who were usually the ones evaluating the tests, weren't necessarily the most competent people in the corporate environment, which is something that hasn't changed very much. They were very badly trained, and they believed that there were no differences between people that couldn't be eliminated with training, which is like, yeah, no, that's wrong. As anybody, if you have any sense at all and you think about it for 15 or 20 seconds, you know that's the case. I don't know what it was like in your school, but in the school I went to, which was way the hell up in northern Alberta in the middle of no man's land, there was at least 15% of the students, I would say, it's probably higher, who were still functionally illiterate by the time they hit grade 10. Functional illiteracy being they had never read an entire book. And that's way more common than you think. I don't know how common you think that is, but the stats basically indicate there's as many people with IQs of 85 and lower as there are people with IQs of 115 and higher. So, and I already said that the minimum IQ level of anybody in this room is likely to be something around 115. So the person in this room who has the lowest general cognitive ability is smarter than 85% of the general population. At 85 and lower, which is, there's just as many people there as there is at 115 and higher. At 85 and lower, then you don't get literacy. So people with IQs of 90 or less have a difficult time translating written words into action, so they can't really read instructions. So, and that's like 10% of the population, 15% of the population.
1 and 2.
15% of the population. And it's so, you might say, well, no way. It's like, well, you don't get to have an opinion on this, by the way, because the science has already been done. But I can tell you one fact that's pretty unsettling. So the United States Army has been doing IQ testing on its recruits since before World War I. They actually did a lot of the research that established IQ tests and validated them and indicated that they were reliable and so forth. And they had a variety of reasons for doing that. Partly, I guess, they didn't want to put incompetent people in charge of deadly machinery, which, does seem to be a reasonable proposition, I would say. But what they found, though, as a consequence of their 100 years of testing was that you couldn't teach anybody with an IQ of 83 or lower anything at all that would make them anything but an obstacle to the tasks that the armed forces had to complete on a regular basis. So that's 83. So now in the United States, it's actually illegal to induct anyone into the armed forces if they have an IQ of 83 or lower. And that's more than 10% of the population. Now you got to think about that, because what it means is that approximately 10% of the population is sufficiently has sufficiently low general cognitive ability that one of the complex enterprises that's chronically most desperate for manpower has decided that there's no point in even trying. Now that's a dismal outcome.
Deep fly ball to right field.
But I don't know exactly what you're supposed to do with that fact, but ignoring it doesn't seem to me to be the right thing, because it doesn't solve the problem. And this is going to become an increasingly present and unavoidable, unignorable problem.
Just got a piece of that one.
You know already that's what's happening in developed countries, less so in underdeveloped countries. But in developed countries, the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing. So, for example, almost all of the increases in wealth that have accrued to people in the last 20 years have accrued to people who are in the top 1% of the distribution of wealth. And that's not going to stop, by the way. And part of the reason is that cognitive power has become even more valuable than it was 40 years ago, and the reason for that is computers, basically. Because if you're really smart and you're good with a computer, you're way ahead of someone who isn't very smart and who doesn't know how to use computers at all. And you're not just a little bit ahead. You're leaps and bounds ahead, and worse than that, you're getting farther ahead all the time. And the reason for that is that computational power keeps increasing, and it increases a lot. It's doubling about every 18 months. So part of the problem that the human race is going to have to face in the next 30 years, along with many other problems, is what are you going to do with people who have neither the cognitive ability nor the conscientiousness to find a niche in society that's actually that other people will value enough to pay for? That's really the question. What do you do? Well, the conservative answer to that is, well, there's a job for everyone. It's like, no, that's wrong. There isn't. And the liberal answer is, well, everybody's the same, so it's just a matter of training. And that's also wrong. They're both of those positions are, the scientific research has rendered them permanently outdated.
This left-handed hitter is pretty average when he's facing right-handed pitching. And a pitch high.
Well, there is the possibility of providing a minimum income. The question, what will that do, is completely unanswered. We have no idea what it will do. And I mean, it might stop people from starving to death, although I wouldn't say in North America that's generally not a problem people have anyways. But
just inside,
we don't know. See, I think of human beings as pack animals fundamentally.
That play was pure self-defense.
It's a metaphor in some sense. I don't think that people can be happy unless they are burdened down with something, like a sled dog is burdened down with something. You have to have responsibilities. They have to be important responsibilities. You have to be sequenced in your time. Most of the people I have in my clinical practice, if they're not employed, they just fall apart. And the conscientious ones fall apart because they eat themselves up with shame and guilt. And the unconscientious ones fall apart because their sleep schedule goes all over the place. They don't eat regularly anymore. They do all sorts of impulsive things that are counterproductive. And, you know, they just sort of spiral into a pool of meaninglessness.
Hit towards first.
So
He's got it. What a
human beings are
tremendous
pretty
diving
social
play.
and we're pretty altruistic, you know, in some
Easy
weird
out.
manner. And it doesn't seem to me that people can live a life that's acceptable if all they have is enforced leisure.
The next batter is
So
Mike Lowe.
maybe that'll be wrong. If you provided people with a base salary,
Really doesn't hit for average,
maybe
but he'll
people
get the
would figure
job.
out what to do with their spare time. But I doubt it. I don't think people are. I think it's very, very difficult for people to regulate themselves in the absence of a certain minimum of social structuring and guidance.
this one
I've
into
seen
left
very,
field.
very few people who can conjure that up on their own and manage it for
over.
extensive
After
periods
two,
of
the
time. I think I've
score
only
is
met
1-0.
one person, I would say, in my whole life who's actually
Stepping
managed.
in, Sean
And
Figueroa.
that particular person has a very large array of talents and is extremely intelligent. So,
Strike called at the knees.
all right. So, you might ask, well, what exactly is intelligence? Maybe what exactly is the ability to abstract? And I think it's something like this. The world is made out of. The world is a very, very high resolution place. No matter how much you zoom into something, you can zoom in more. There's information that more and more and more and more levels of detail. And then also, no matter how far you back away from something, there's more and more and more levels of detail.
He's got 11
So,
wins and 8 losses
you
this
guys
season.
are composed of a whole variety of
And here's the
subsystems,
delivery.
complex functioning subsystems, all the way down to the
Arroyo
subatomic
delivers
level,
the ball,
and
2
then
and
above
2.
your phenomenological
Sometimes you try to
level
make
of
the hitter chase your
perception,
pitch. That's
you're
exactly what
members
you
of
saw right
families, you're members of cities,
3-2
you're members
count.
of
Sometimes you
provinces,
try to make the hitter
and
chase your pitch. That's
nationalities
exactly what you
and
saw right
international organizations and
He hits
ecological
it over towards
structures
second.
and so forth and so on. And all of
The
that's
catch is made.
characteristic of you all the
Next up,
time
Carl Crawford.
and in every situation. But you don't deal with all that information, and you can't. And so one of the things that people seem to have learned how to
He
do is
delivers a called
abstract
strike.
things. And I'm
He
not
showed
exactly
excellent
sure
command
what
with
it
that
means
pitch,
to
a strike
abstract,
right on
but
the
it
edge of the
seems to
zone.
me that it means something
Last
that's
to
similar
the
to
second
producing
baseman. 1, 2,
a low
3,
resolution
and the inning is
representation,
over.
like a thumbnail. And so
After
actually,
2 and
when
a
I
half,
look at
Tampa
each of
Bay
you,
trails
what I'm
by
actually
1.
seeing is a thumbnail of what you are.
Veritek is next.
First of all, obviously, I don't see the other side of you, or either side for that matter. I only see you face on.
That's
so in some
over
sense,
for a
it's a
strike.
two-dimensional
guy can really
thumbnail,
hurt
and
you
then
with
I have
balls
no
up the zone.
idea what's going on in the subsystems that constitute you at levels outside, you know, underneath your mere surface.
pitch.
That's a complex diagnostic problem. For example, if there was something wrong with you, and
Got
I
him
can't
for
see
the
your
out.
families or except in very low
Dirksen
resolution
kicks his
ways
turn
for
at bat.
nationality or any of the
This guy
systems
has
that
a
you're
great
identified
velocity hitting, and that makes
with
him just a
and
pretty
embedded
special
in.
hitter.
So just looking at you is an
He
act
gives
of
up
abstraction.
everything to get that ball
And
kicked.
part of that, thankfully, is done by
Ortiz
the
is
fact
next
that our
up.
sensory systems just aren't that good. So there's a whole bunch of things we
Out of
can't
the zone,
perceive,
that's a ball.
and that
Sometimes you try to make
simplifies
the
the
hitter chase
problem.
your pitch.
Now,
That's
what
exactly
we're
you saw
hoping is
right
that
there.
I can perceive enough of you
Out of the
at
zone,
a
that's
given
a
time
ball.
so that if I
He's trying
interact
to
with
tip the
you,
batter to go after the
I get
fastball
what I
outside the
want and
strike
you
zone.
get what you want, roughly speaking. It's something like that.
3-ball count.
So what we hope
right,
is
he
the
has one
model,
great pitch, and he sticks with
the
it to
abstract
get batters
model,
out.
even of perception itself, is sufficiently accurate
He
so
walks
that
him on 4
it's sufficiently, it's a
Walks
sufficiently
always seem to come
unbiased
around to hurt you.
sample of the
Falls
reality
behind
that
the
it
batter,
reflects,
never
so that
gets
if I
back to
interact
the
with it,
bat.
things work out the way that I would like them to
Cabrera
work
comes
out.
to
But
the plate.
there's lots of times when that doesn't happen at all. Right? It doesn't
The
happen
count's
when you're sick.
0-1.
He's
The
kind of
fact
guy
is
managers
that
just
your,
love.
the resolution of your sensory apparatus is a huge
Misses
impediment
for
to
a
figuring
ball.
out why you might be ill. You know, and it doesn't help much either when people are engaged in struggles that go beyond the
zone,
merely
that's a
personal.
ball.
So if I happen to be the member of one ethnic group and you happen to be the member
ball
of
is hit
another,
out
and
towards third
there's
base.
strife between
Guy
those
gets
two
quick
ethnic
reaction, a lot
groups,
of men
then
can play on that
the
line
fact
drive.
that I can
Nice
perceive
play.
you at this level of resolution might have very little to do with my
Up
ability
next,
to solve that
Aubrey
particular
Huff.
problem. Now, Obviously, people can abstract, and part of that's just built into us so that we abstract the phenomena that we see. But then human beings, I think, in some sense are capable of meta-abstraction. So I think what happens is you can imagine that there's the phenomena in and of itself, whatever that is, that complicated multi-layer thing that's always in front of you. And then there's your representation of it, which is what you perceive, which is already abstracted to a tremendous degree and limited to a tremendous degree. And then there's abstractions of that. So what it seems to me to be is that language is a thumbnail of images that are a thumbnail of the reality of things. It's something like that. So it's a dual compression. So if I say cat to you, what the word cat does for you is produce the image of a generic cat, which is already a kind of abstraction, and then that's attached to your understanding in some sense, so that you can generate understanding that would go along with, at least in part, with perceiving or interacting with a real cat. So in some sense what you're doing is, I'm compressing the information down to a tremendously low-resolution thumbnail, and I'm throwing that at you, and you decompress it into a low-resolution image, and then you decompress that into something that's roughly equivalent to reality. That's what you're doing when you're reading a book, for example, right? Because when you read the book, you can conjure up images of the places that the author is talking about. You conjure up images of the characters themselves. So, to such a degree that if you go to see a movie that's made of your favorite book, you might be irritated because the person in the movie looks nothing like the person that you read about, at least as far as your imagination was concerned. Now, intelligence in general seems to be whatever underlies the ability to generate those low-resolution representations to utilize them. So that would mean to manipulate them in your own mind, but also to communicate them to others. A big part of intelligence is working memory. And working memory is, well, while you're sitting there thinking, if you're thinking, how many of you think in words primarily as far as you're concerned? So, how many of you don't? Think in images?
Swing and a miss.
Anybody?
The ball was
Images?
And he's down on strikes.
Well, that's another
He's gotta be more
possibility. How
selective
many of
if
you
there were
think in
two
words
strikes.
and images?
That was ugly.
Okay. So, okay. Well, that's fine. The images are already a representation, and in many ways, the words are a representation of the images. And so, your ability to abstract and then your ability to manipulate those abstractions seems to be at the core of whatever intelligence is, and that's what IQ purports to measure. Your working memory. So when if you sit there right now, so let's do this. Here is the sentence to think about. Okay, now think about that sentence. Okay, so the faculty that you're using to represent that sentence to yourself is working memory. And it's not very powerful. You can't contain very much in your working memory.
If ever they're going to
7
steal a bag,
digits
it's
is
right
about
now with this guy.
the max.
He really
Now,
knows how to
people
steal a
vary.
bag.
Some people think that
1-1
4
count.
bits of information is actually the limit to working memory. Some people think it's closer to 7, but it's not very much. That's why telephone numbers tend to be 7 digits long.
And that's a strike
You kind of
swinging.
easily remember 7 things, which is not very many things. So part of what your intelligence is the breadth of that working memory, and then the
Mahomes
speed
goes
with
down
which
on
you can run
strikes.
abstractions through
With
it.
5 innings left to
So,
play, the Devil Rays
Now,
trail by
I
1.
put a little map here up.
The next
so
batter
the
is
thing on
Ken
the top
Harvey.
left, well, that's sort of a multi-dimensional. It's a schema of a multi-dimensional reality, and if you look at that, what it is, it's a collection of dots or circles arrayed in a variety of different arrays. My proposition is that you can represent that array in a variety of different ways. I've called them Object 1. You can't see Object 2. It's a slide error. Object 3, Object 4, and Object 5. Those are all low-resolution representations of the thing that's in the top left-hand corner. And you can see that, in some sense, they capture something important.
28 home runs and 99
They capture
RBIs.
some important element of the thing in the top left-hand corner, but they don't capture all of it.
Foul,
Now,
but
it might
should
be
stay
that
in
not
play.
capturing all of it is a good idea, because you don't want to use
foul
any more
territory
information than you
makes
have
the
to.
catch.
Again, at the bottom, well, those are words
This
or
guy isn't
semantic
great
symbols
against
of one
right-handed
form or
pitching,
another,
but he
and
does all
they
right.
represent the representations.
Brinkman takes
Um,
low.
I saw Temple Grandin speak once. I don't remember if I told you about this, but she's a very famous autistic researcher. She's quite autistic, and she's very fun to listen to.
Hits a foul
She's
ball.
quite a good public speaker, which is quite remarkable. She's trying to figure out, she thinks that autistic people think like animals. And she actually works with animals, and she seems to be very good at understanding them. She believes that what things that frighten her are the same thing that frightens animals, and for the same reasons. And so her proposition, for example, is that if I say the word church, all of you people are going to have what you might describe as a schematic abstraction, like a hieroglyph that's more or less representative of the class of churches. Or maybe I could say house. Kids are good at this. You see this house. It's like it's got a little rectangle on the top, and it's got a kind of a square on the bottom. It's got a door and two windows, and the windows have crosses in them, and there's always a chimney on top with smoke coming out, which I think is quite remarkable because you actually don't see that many houses now that have chimneys with smoke coming out. But still, that's the canonical image for a child.
He takes a pitch high.
Temple Grandin's claim was that she cannot see house.
He broke his bat on the
She can
ball
only
to the
see
left
a
side.
house. And so if you say to her something like house, then what comes to mind is a particular house that she's actually experienced. She can't take the next level of abstraction past that, which seems to be something like a deficit in generating like a hieroglyphic image. One of the ways to think about children's drawings, you know, how they draw people with sticks and circles, you know, you think, oh, that's so primitive. It's like, no, it's not. It's unbelievably sophisticated because those aren't pictures, they're hieroglyphics. And the child automatically produces them, and that's a proto-linguistic development. So some autistic kids can draw like Leonardo da Vinci with no training whatsoever, and that's partly because they don't use hieroglyphics, and that means that they don't really conceptualize the thing they're looking at as an abstraction. They see nothing but detail. And if you're training yourself to be a visual artist, you have to stop looking at the abstraction and you have to start looking at the thing. And that's very unsettling. So if you take your hand, for example, and you look at it and you snap it out as hand representation, when you do that properly, it all of a sudden looks like some kind of like octopus claw. It's a very bizarre looking thing. And as soon as you see it that way, you can draw it. But as long as you're seeing it like a hand, you're going to put, you know, a balloon with 4 balloons on it or something like that, and that's going to be the hand. So,
Swing and a miss. He hits it over towards second.
This guy's name is John Carroll. Carroll's a real scientist. He looked at
Jason Veritek.
the structure of IQ for a very long period of time. Wrote a very thick book on
the
it.
swing.
I'm surprised he didn't say anything to the
Nobody
umpire
likes
about
to
the
read
call. There's
because
no
it's
way
almost
he went
entirely technical. So it's
Hit
really more of
towards
a
the
reference
shortstop.
book. But what
2 gone.
Carroll hypothesized, and I think his hypothesis is as close to state of the art as any, is that there's a stratum 3 level, which is
The
fluid
book on this dude
intelligence.
says stay away because he loves the
G.
ball under his hands.
And it's the main factor that unites all
Makes
these
a
other
pitch
tests.
high.
And then at
Sometimes
stratum
you
1,
try
you
to
get
make the
fluid
hitter chase your
intelligence,
ear.
crystallized
Exactly what you
intelligence,
saw right
verbal
there.
intelligence. I don't remember what the rest of them stand for. And then each of those can be subdivided into
He's on
specific
first
tests,
with a
and each of
base
the
hit.
tests can be subdivided into somewhat
Next at the plate,
particularized
David Ortiz.
individual cognitive abilities. Now,
Over to first with the
they're not
pickoff
that
throw.
individual because there's a single factor that accounts for most of the variability in the performance. So,
1-0 count.
Tell you what, this guy's got an uncanny knack
in
for
a
picking
sense,
good
what
pitches
this
to
theory
steal on.
says
He
is
may
that
be going
the
right here.
intelligences sum up to one intelligence.
Out of the zone,
And
that's
that
a
seems
ball.
to be essentially correct. This, although you can't see it
3
very well,
balls, no strikes.
if you look at G there on the left, the lines leading to the
Takes
first,
the walk.
or I think that's the
Nothing
second strata,
positive
the
comes
next
out of this
strata
guy.
anyways,
He's
show
falling
you the
behind,
correlation
he's falling behind,
between
finally
G
launched the guy.
and each of the individual
batter is
intelligences.
Miguel
And what you see is
Cabrera.
the correlation between G and fluid intelligence is 0.94, which is such a tight correlation that it might as well just be the thing itself.
delivers.
Between
Pitch
G
missed
and
inside.
crystallized intelligence is 0.85. All of the first order correlations
The
there are
count's
above 0.8.
2-1.
That's exactly, and then at the far right you get concepts
It's
that
hit
you
out
might
to
think
center.
about as particularized, and So
That's the third
those
out
include
with men
concept
left on
formation,
first and
analysis and synthesis, number
With 5
series,
innings
number
played, the
matrices, spatial
score is
relations,
1-0.
picture recognition, block
Stepping
rotation,
in,
visual
Aubrey
matching,
Huff.
decision speed,
This left-hander just hits the ball hard.
block
and he hits it
rotation,
hard all the time.
cross out, visual and auditory learning, memory for names, sound blending, incomplete word, that would be incomplete word completion,
Hit hard
sound
back up the
patterns,
middle.
auditory attention, etc., etc. And you can think of those each
He
as
reaches
individual
with a
tests
leadoff
in that
single.
you could make a test
Well, now
that
that they've got
theoretically
somebody on,
only
let's see if they can go to
individually
work.
assessed that thing, but you couldn't help but be testing all sorts of other things at the same time because they're not actually individual. One of the things you will learn
He fouled
is
it
that
off to the left.
there are neuropsychological tests, and the neuropsychologists like to think that IQ is something that's primitive and that they've already, what would you say, advanced past. And so they have specific
That's a 3-pitch strikeout.
prefrontal
pitches, 3
tests,
strikes,
say,
they
that
can use their
hypothetically assess specific prefrontal abilities. And then they'll note that if you take a
One
single
down and
test
a
of
runner on
prefrontal
first.
ability and correlate it with IQ,
Pitch
it'll only
misses
correlate
for a
at about
ball.
0.3 or
Hey,
0.4,
partner, if the pitcher
and then
can
they'll
keep the ball
assume
low
because it
zone, he
only
might be able to
correlates
induce a ground
that
ball to
low
start,
that
too.
it's measuring something other
to
than
center
what
field.
IQ is measuring. But really what happens is that it's just not a very good IQ test, and the reason that the correlation is so
Rays
low
have
is because
activated
of
the
measurement
bullpen.
error. So if you gave the same
God, he
test
didn't get all that
to the
ball.
same
Fielder
person
strolled over,
20
got it,
times,
made an easy play.
and then you varied the test so there were 30 variants of it, and you gave those all to the same person 20 times, then what would come out would be a score that would be much more highly correlated
Taken
with
for a
IQ
ball.
and probably indistinguishable from it. And so you'll learn from neuropsychologists that there's such a thing as prefrontal
Pitch
ability,
taken
and
for a
that's
ball.
associated with
God, with
executive
that first
control,
baseman holding the runner
and that's
up, there's a
associated
big
with
hole on the right side of the
self-regulation,
infield. He's
which
gotta be
would be
thinking about
control
that
over
with
your
hitting that
impulses.
ball.
And as far as I can tell, that's all completely wrong. And it took me like
He
10
balls a
years to
one strike.
figure that out because I was taught that it was right, and it wasn't until I plowed through it painfully and understood that there was no evidence for that. So I can tell you how that works.
Full
So,
count
for
here.
example, we gave a neuropsych battery that consisted of dorsolateral
He
prefrontal
delivers.
tests for
The runner's
3,000
moving.
people, 90-minute
Oh, it's too
batteries.
bad he
It was
watched this guy. He
exhausting.
just lets him get away.
And when we factor analyzed it, when there was only about 200
Next up,
participants, we
Ken
got
Harvey.
4 factors. But then when we factor analyzed it after we had 3,000 participants, we got 2 factors.
First and second with
And
2
one
down.
was one on which almost
Out
all
of
the
the
tests
zone,
loaded,
that's
and
a
it was
ball.
undoubtedly fluid intelligence. So, but it's worse than that, you know, because you hear about how the prefrontal cortex regulates behavior. Well, here's a problem with that. What's the correlation between IQ and conscientiousness? 0,
Sends it foul.
roughly speaking. It's probably a little off 0, although it might not be. And you know that because the dimensions of the big 5 are roughly orthogonal. I showed you at the
2-2
beginning
count.
of this that each trait of the big 5 traits is correlated with the other trait on an average of about 0.2. Now, why that is, it's
Payoff
probably
pitch
because
coming.
of something
He
like,
swiped 2 bases.
what would you call it? It's
Both
probably
runners
a
are
halo
moving.
effect.
The
If you
fielder
tend
is
to rate
retreating.
yourself as positive on one
Indeed,
trait,
trouble as it
more
bounces up
conscientious,
against the
more
wall.
agreeable, more
A
emotionally
run
stable,
crosses
you're
the
going to
plate.
tend to
He's in
rate
there
yourself as
safely
more
at
positive
second.
on the other traits.
That hit is going to
So
score
that
a
would
runner and
artificially
keep the
inflate
inning
the
alive.
correlation. That's one way of looking at it. Anyways, weirdly enough, the correlation between conscientiousness and IQ is essentially 0. Now that's a big problem, isn't it? Because it's unconscientious people that seem to be behaviorally dysregulated, right? They can't stick to a task. They jump about. They're not on track. They appear impulsive, although we don't know how to define impulsive, by the way, but your real psychologists use that all the time. It's like,
There's a line
well, if
drive.
prefrontal ability regulates behavior, how come the correlation
And the
between
run scores.
intelligence
That
and other
goes for the Devil
forms
Rays
of
in the 6th.
executive control are correlated with conscientiousness at 0, right? 0 is a very bad number when
Going
you're
into the
testing out a
bottom of the
hypothesis.
6th. The score is 2-1.
So, and you know, if you think about it, it has to be that way, and the reason it has to be that way is
Next,
this.
Lance Berkman.
So if you're dreaming, you're going to just lay there and dream, eh? But your eyes are going to move back and forth. Now you might say, why aren't you running around acting out your dreams while you're dreaming? And the answer to that is there's a little switch in your head,
In the air
roughly
foul, but
speaking,
there's room to make a
that shuts
play.
off your motor
He puts it away
apparatus
in
when you're
foul
dreaming. And so
territory.
what happens is
Hey, partner, he
you
may not
can't
wanna
run
think
around
about
and
this
act
game
out
for a
all your
while.
dreams because
Hasn't
you're
exactly
paralyzed.
been a shiny
And
moment
sometimes
this
people
career.
wake up in that state. It's called sleep paralysis. They wake up, they're sort of half awake,
Ramirez
and they
slays
can't
on
move.
outside
And then they
for a
often
ball.
hallucinate all sorts of weird things and think aliens have come and abducted them and various peculiarities.
One ball, one strike.
If you take a cat and you take out that little switch, then the cat will run around while it's dreaming until it runs into something, which is the problem with running around acting out your dreams.
Huff
So,
made a great play on that
what
ball,
does that
partner. That ball
allow
looked
one
like it was
to
going to
conclude?
drop, but a great dive took away any
Well,
thoughts
if you
of that.
couldn't abstract away from your behavior, you couldn't think, right? Because what thinking means is to represent an alternative world, or maybe just a tiny little fraction of the world, whatever, to represent it abstractly, to manipulate it around, but not to simultaneously act it out. Then it wouldn't be abstracting at all. It would be fiddling about with the world through trial and error. So you have to be able to pull what you think about out of your body, so to speak, play with it, and then implement it back in. Now, it looks maybe like the ability to implement a plan is associated with conscientiousness, but we don't understand that. That would be industriousness. And we don't know a bloody thing about industriousness. It's just a black hole. But the idea that it's your ability to think that allows you to regulate your behavior strikes a thought. There's no evidence for it. There's no evidence for it. Smart people are not necessarily better at regulating their behavior.
He really knows how to steal
So,
a bag.
because you can have a very unconscientious smart person, and I see them in my clinical practice now, and then they come and say, well, I'm really smart, and here's the evidence, but I'm doing very badly in everything. They're underachievers, roughly speaking. You know, so they can't implement their thoughts, not in any stable manner. So the fact that they're smart, you know, on average across their life, smart people are healthier mentally and physically than people who aren't as smart. But the reason for that isn't because their intelligence allows them to regulate their health. The reason for that is because their intelligence allows them, roughly speaking, to succeed, so they're higher up in the dominance hierarchy. And if you're higher up in the dominance hierarchy, then your life isn't as stressful and you don't get sick as often. But that doesn't indicate that there's a direct control between your intelligence and your behavioral output. There's very little evidence for that. Well, I think there's no evidence for it. So that's rather shocking. So, you know, to me, that just wiped out a whole
ground, but he should have room.
Substrata of psychological theorizing. I'm sure. How many of you have come up against the proposition that prefrontal ability is associated with behavioral control?
When he's facing a righty on the
yeah, yeah. Well,
he's batting
it isn't.
286.
So,
12 home runs and 47
not any more than
RBIs.
First of all, it's not differentiable
right
from
side.
IQ,
He
regardless
fouled
of what
it
the
off to the right.
neuropsychologists say. Because they don't know anything about psychometrics generally, and they don't like IQ, because if they studied IQ, then what they'd find is all the things that they're studying are
And the
basically
count is
variants of
2-1.
IQ, and that would suck, because other people have already figured out IQ. And then there's the big problem,
Jones
which is,
hits
well,
it out to center.
variation in prefrontal ability, which is equivalent to variation
Ground
in
rule
IQ, isn't
double.
correlated with behavioral control. It's a really big problem. So,
Well, they're lucky right there.
and so I would like to say, well, what is correlated with behavioral control? And then the problem with that is, well, I don't know what you mean by behavioral control. I don't know how you're going to measure it. And if you do measure it, the probability that you're going to come up with something like conscientiousness is pretty much 100%.
Next at the plate,
So-
Carl Crawford.
All right.
Action in the bullpen. The manager's out to buy some time.
The pitcher really needs to slow down and refocus. Seems like that trip to the mound came just at the right time. Oh, this is a good move,
Yes,
Kai, because
effect
left-handed
sizes.
hitters
This is
have
from
some
a very
trouble picking up
important
the
paper
off-speed
by a guy
pitches from
named
left-handed
Hemphill
pitchers.
called Interpreting the Magnitudes of Correlation Coefficients from the American Psychologist, number 58. What Hemphill did was look at he didn't guess at how big an effect size had to be for it to be a big effect size. What he did was go into
1-0
literature
the
and
count.
study a whole bunch of
Sometimes
papers
you try to make
and then
the hitter
empirically
chase your
rank
picks.
the
That's
effect
exactly what
sizes,
you
so
saw
that would
right
be
there.
the standard deviation difference or the correlation or the R squared.
Out
You
of
can
the
convert
zone,
those.
that's a ball.
And then decide, you know, what proportion of papers had which effect
He
size.
delivers.
And decide that, well, you could empirically rank them and then
Fastball
you know
misses high.
how big your effect size was. And what he found was that about 3% of social science studies showed a correlation coefficient of 0.5 or above. And that's about the correlation between IQ and general life success in relatively
The
complex
count runs full.
conditions. 0.35 to 0.5, only about 1 in 4 papers to 1 in 10.
Makes the catch
an R
to record
0.15
the
to
out.
0.35,
That's a
25
great
to
play on a very
57%
tough line
of
drive.
papers, and
That's
then
one of the toughest
R
balls in
less than
baseball to
0.15
judge.
was about a quarter of the papers. So what that means is the ability of IQ to predict whatever it is that you want to predict
This
with
could be
it
the
is
biggest
way the
at-bat of
hell
the ball
up
game.
in,
Runners on and a
in
dangerous
the rare,
hitter coming to the plate.
what would you call it?
Deep fly fly ball hit the left.
Well, it's up in the stratosphere with regards to
Side
effect
retired.
power.
It's time for the 7th inning
Okay,
stretch.
so what does it mean, practically speaking? This is from a company called the Wunderlich Company. And the Wunderlich sells IQ tests to businesses. Now, it's actually illegal for businesses to use IQ tests in the United States. So actually, it's illegal to do anything to hire employees in the United States, as it turns out, because
The corners
you
are
have to
close
use
to
a
the
test.
lines.
You have to use the test that's the most
Left-handed
valid
pitcher
and
to
reliable,
the plate
available,
to face the righty.
that doesn't produce
pitcher,
any ethnic
Johnny
or gender
Damon.
differences. Well, there's no test like that. So it's illegal. So it's illegal to use
And here's
interviews.
the pitch.
It's illegal to use letters of reference. It's
Misses
illegal to use
outside.
ability tests. You might be able to use conscientiousness tests, because conscientiousness tests do
It's hit
seem
over
to be
towards third.
completely free of,
Got him at first base.
not exactly, because older people are more
Stepping
conscientious
in,
than younger
Jason
people, and that's
Veritas.
also correct. Anyways, Wunderlich, it's a good company. It makes really,
Tries to
its
golf
IQ
one,
tests
but
are
missed.
genuine
That's
tests,
a strike.
but they are IQ tests. And people do use them in business, even though they're not supposed to. But what they've done over a long period of using the test is to come up with approximations for different forms of employment opportunities. So how
taken
smart
for
do
a
you have
ball.
to be in order to be
Sometimes you try to make the hitter chase your pitch. That's
placed in a
exactly
given
what you saw
occupation
right
with a
there.
reasonable probability of success? So
Taken for a
we
ball.
tell you here. So is that exactly the right place?
The count is full.
Sometimes you try to make the hitter chase your pitch. That's exactly what you saw right there.
Okay, so if you have IQs of 116
Liner hit
to
the
130,
opposite way to the left
that's
side.
pretty much
They're
you
making a
guys,
pitching
although I
change.
suspect there's a
Correa
fair
comes
chunk
in
of
from
you
the
that have an
bullpen.
IQ of over 130. Because 130 makes you, 115 makes you 15%, 130 makes you about 98 percentile, 145 makes you 99th percentile, 160 makes you 99.9th percentile. Something else to think about. Percentiles are strange things, because you might say, well, there's no difference between someone who scores 95th percentile on an IQ test and 99th percentile. It's only 4 percentiles.
He's
difference.
laid
That's
out.
not
He's
4
got it.
percentiles.
What a great
The person who
diving
scores
catch.
95 is 1 in
This dude's
20.
got some kind of athletic
The person who
ability.
scores 99 is 1 in
With
100.
2 innings
The
remaining,
person who
the
scores
score is
99.9
2-1.
is 1 in 1,000. So, and you might think,
Due
well,
up
it doesn't matter
the
because
middle of
as
the order.
you know, once you get to a certain degree of smart, that's smart enough, and now that's wrong. In fact, it's probably radically wrong in that the differences between people actually increase as you go up the IQ scale. So,
Lifts one to right.
and that's because performance isn't distributed in a normal
Puts it away
distribution,
for
it's
the out.
distributed in
The
a
Devil
Pareto
Rays are
distribution
getting their
such that
bullpen ready.
almost no one does anything
nice
and a
pitch there
very
to get the
small
fly
number
ball.
of
Nice
people
work.
do everything. So, which is also a very dismal fact.
No one
Okay,
should
so
be
anyways, if
surprised
you're in the
this guy
upper
decides to lay one down.
echelons of the cognitive
You need to
distribution,
rally.
so
It's a whole lot worse than sending this guy to play, partner. He delivers.
Hit to right field.
from 116 to 130, you could be an attorney, a research analyst, an editor, an advertising manager, a chemist,
Save.
engineer,
He
an
slides in there
executive,
with a
a
double.
manager,
Say,
trainee,
not many
systems
guys can turn
analyst,
that
or
into
an
a double.
auditor.
Great piece of hitting, and
From
I'm talking some
115
extra
to
hard to get to
110,
second base
110 to
sack.
115. So that'd be in the upper half of a high school graduating class, roughly speaking. Upper quarter.
Takes the pitch just off the
Copywriter,
plate, 1-0.
accountant, manager / supervisor, sales manager, salesman, programmer, analyst, teacher, adjuster, general manager, purchasing agent, registered nurse, sales account executive.
The ball is
108
hit
to
center.
103.
Berkman
Administrative
should have no
assistant,
problem.
store manager,
He's got it.
bookkeeper, credit clerk, drafter, designer, lab tester,
Okay, this dude did
secretary,
not bring his
accounting
A
clerk,
game in,
medical,
but
debt
in
collection,
fairness, you
computer
can't be
operator,
on all the
customer
time.
service rep, automotive salesman, clerk, and typist. 102 to 100, so that's pretty much
Keep
right at
scoring
the mean.
runs. It's cashing in
Dispatcher,
run-scoring situations.
general office
see if they
dispatcher,
can knock in
police
that guy
patrol
second
officer,
school run.
receptionist, cashier, general clerical work, inside sales
That
clerk,
takes
meter
care of the
reader,
side.
printer, teller, data entry, or an
After
electrical
7.5,
helper.
the score is 2-1. He's done for the day. They're going to the bullpen.
For IQ from 95 to 98, machinist, quality control checker, claims
Next
clerk,
up,
driver,
the
delivery
York
man,
Yankees.
security guard, unskilled labor, maintenance, machine operator, arc welder, mechanic, medical dental assistant. From 87 to 93, messenger, factory production assembler, food service worker, nurse's aide, warehouseman, custodian, janitor, material handler, and hacker.
And on 3 pitches, he's gone.
Hey, he gets strike one. He just keeps plowing away for the strikeout.
So you see that things are getting pretty damn dismal for the people who have an IQ of 85 and below.
Up next, Miguel Cabrera. Misses outside.
Now,
He delivers.
what's the difference
Pitch
between
taken for a ball.
intellect
He
and
swiped
openness
22
property?
bases.
Well, one difference is that men seem to be higher in intellect, the trait, and women seem to be higher in openness. And openness seems to be associated with verbal intelligence, and with
liner.
imagination,
The catch is
and
made
with
by the
fantasy,
third baseman.
and with aesthetic experience. And it seems to go
Next at
along
the
with the
plate,
fact that
Lance
women read more
Berkman.
fiction than men. So men read non-fiction, roughly speaking, and women read
Takes the
fiction.
pitch just off the
Obviously,
plate.
there's a lot of overlap, but fundamentally that seems to be how it distributes.
That's a
Maybe that's
strike to
also
even
partly
again.
because women are more agreeable, and so they're more interested in human relations and characters. You know, that's the central theme of
Swing.
fiction.
You're gonna miss 1 and 2.
People who are high in openness think divergently. Here, we can do a quick little divergent thinking test. So why don't we do that? Take out a
There's a
piece of
line
paper and a
drive.
pen. Or you
He's
can
up
type
with
on
a
the
single.
computer. I don't care. You just scratch it
He
onto
was
the desk.
sitting
Or
dead
like,
red. He got the
go on,
heat and he
get out a piece of
smoked
paper,
it.
something you can write on, and we'll do this. So I'll only give you a minute since
Lays
you're all
off
so
inside
fast,
for a ball.
and we only have 6 minutes left. So write down as many uses as you can
It's
think
hit
of
out
for
to
a brick.
center field.
You have 1 minute.
The side is retired with 1 man left on base. After 8, Boston trails by 1. Brinkman steps into the batter's box.
Here we go. This is what it's all about, big boy.
And the pitch. He comes up a little bit short. Out! The Devil Rays have a righty getting loose in the bullpen. The next batter is Sean Figgins.
Okay, that's all the time you get. Okay, so the first question is, I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to point at you and you can answer. How many uses did you come up with? 13. 5. You 2. Yeah, that's okay. 8. That's all right.
Out of the zone, that's a
7.
ball.
7. Okay, did anybody come up with more than 13? How many?
Taken for a ball.
14. Did anybody come up
Sometimes
with
you
more
try to
than
make a
14?
hitter chase your picks. That's exactly
Okay, so
what you
you
saw
two
right
are the
there.
most ideationally fluent people in the class.
Pitch taken for
And
a
fluency
ball.
is a matter of the rapidity with which you can generate exemplars from a category. So one of the things that we might ask just as
3
much would be
balls,
how many
1
words
strike.
can you write that begin with the letter S in a minute? And you wouldn't believe the bloody range of that. There'll be people who
3
get
and
6 and
2.
there'll be people who get 50. You know, so ideational fluency is actually a pretty decent predictor of creative
He's
ability.
called out
Now,
on
you know, that's
strike.
not a great test, right? Because it was very short. And I do that multiple times with multiple
talking
time
about making
durations
quick
and
hits
just
right
different
there. He's really
exemplars and
backed
some
up
across
against the
that.
wall,
But the
and then he
correlation
digs
between
deep,
ideational
makes great
fluency and
pitches, and
long-term
gets the
creative
strikeout.
achievement is about 0.3. It's pretty major. Okay, so let's hear a use for a brick. How about you?
Jones takes inside.
You could
for
draw
a
on the
ball.
sidewalk with the brick. How about you? A paperweight. How many people got paperweight? Yes, that's a low
Taken for a
creative
ball.
response. Now, why? That doesn't mean that all your responses are,
delivery.
but it's a technical definition, right? So here's what makes a response low creative. Everyone has it. Now, it's a perfectly reasonable response, but for it to be creative, virtually
2
by
balls,
definition,
2
it has to be
strikes.
a low probability response that actually makes sense. So draw on sidewalk is
3-2 count.
is a more low probability response. Somebody got a weird use for a brick?
Ground ball to the third baseman. Terrific
Okay,
at bat
okay,
right
all right.
here.
Anybody else have that? They ground their brick into dust for something? No?
The pitch is hit to left
Yes?
field.
You could kill someone with a brick. Anybody have that? Yes. Low agreeableness, low creativity.
He just didn't fool him at all.
Yeah.
That
Okay.
pitch,
So
he
got anybody else
the
got
outfield
like a
for single.
peculiar one for a brick? Yeah. Look. Yeah. Anybody else have that?
One inside.
Okay, so
He
you know
swiped
it's
43
kind of a lousy
bases.
musical instrument, but in a pinch it would work. Yeah. Well, that's a good one. First of all, you can kill it and then you can drown it. Yeah. Yeah. So the way you would score this, by the way, it's quite straight. It's not that straightforward, actually.
That
First of all, you
takes
count the
care of
number
the
of
side with a runner
responses.
left
And you
on
get rid of
first.
ones that are
After
repetitive.
8.5, the
And then
score
you
is
also
2-1.
get usually a couple of people that
And
throw
here
out ones
comes
that
the
are just
hook. Into pitch
like they're
is the
neither
closer,
original
Danny
nor
Baez.
practical. The best responses are original and practical. Now there's a bit of a judgment call there, you know what I mean. But if you get a number of people to do the rating, you can get pretty decent hit and rate or reliability. And so then you score originality, and the way you score
Nobody
originality
out.
is merely by like listing all the responses and then calculating how probable or frequent the responses are, and the more infrequent responses you get a higher score for. So it's basically a population sample. So,
And he's down
and
on
those things
strikes.
actually work.
Hey,
Those,
Kai, if he was
those
able
tests,
to get ahead in the
just
count,
so
the
you
batter
know.
never caught
Now,
up. Good strikeout.
I'll stop with this. This is a measure that I derived with one of my students when I worked in Boston. Her name was Shelley Carson. This thing has actually become one of the standard measures of creativity in the creativity literature, which is quite
Pitcher and
fun.
catcher have strategy
And
in mind.
it's
So
a
far, the
creative
batters have taken
achievement
these
questionnaire. So what I gave you just now was a creativity test. It's one of many creativity tests, but it wasn't a creative achievement test because you can generate uses for a brick without running out and becoming a brick entrepreneur, you know. So there's a difference between being able to think divergently and with loose associations, and then also being able to put that into
It's a
practice
full
so you
count.
achieve something. And so here's some levels of achievement. So there's the scientific
Strike
discovery
three, and he's
domain.
gone.
I do not have
Hey,
training or
fall behind,
recognized ability
makes
in this
great
field.
pitches,
I
however,
often think
comes all the
about
way
ways
back and
that
gets the
scientific
strike.
problems could be solved. I have won a prize at a science fair or other local competition. I've received a scholarship based on my work in science and medicine. I've been author or co-author of a study published in a scientific journal. I've won a national prize. I've received a grant. My work has been cited by
Here
other
comes the
scientists
first
in
pitch of
national
the at-bat.
publications. Okay.
This guy wants
And
to
then
get things
the
going
same
right
thing
here. He's
for,
more
say,
than
theater and
capable of
film
letting
and
his bat
culinary
do his
arts.
job.
0 is I do not have training or recognized
The
ability.
count's even at
In
1.
theater and film, number 7 is my theatrical work has been recognized in a national publication. For culinary arts, I do not have training or experience, and the highest one is
Here's
my
the
recipes
1-2
have been
delivery.
published nationally. Okay,
Fly
so
ball hit to shallow left.
there's
And the
13
game
different
is over.
domains.
The Devil Rays have won 2 straight games. Danny Baez picks up the save.
And that's the distribution.
The final score,
It's not
the
normally
Tampa Bay
distributed.
Devil Rays 2,
So what
the Red
you see
Sox
there,
1.
actually, it's not quite right because the median answer, it's about 66% of the respondents to the Creative Achievement Questionnaire have a median score of 0. Right, 0. They do not have training or talent in any of the 13 areas. And then there's some people who are way out on the right-hand distribution, because you can imagine that once you have national exposure in one magazine as a writer, the probability that you're going to get national exposure again for your second novel starts to go up pretty damn high, right? And so you get this terrible step-down function so that almost everybody aggregates at nothing. And then a few people are way out in the distribution and they just get everything. And there's actually a law, it's called the Matthew Principle, that economists use, and it's from a statement in the New Testament, from Matthew. And it's a statement where Christ says, from those who have